Hello and welcome to Moneylife News and Views. I'm Debashis. Now, there are two views about the Indian economy. On the one hand, there is untramelled boosterism, the dream of becoming a $5 trillion economy, delivered by an ostensibly a long era of perpetual prosperity, which is right in front of us. Now, this is supported by a set of rosy data. Another view is skeptical of such inference based on another set of data. Now, there's enough of data points on either sides, which makes for what I call economic data fog, leaving us confused where exactly is the Indian economy headed. Consider a simple calculation of gross domestic product, GDP, which it's seen to be the single biggest, the most important factor which points to the overall trajectory of any economy. Now, for the first 3 months of this year, the economy grew apparently 7.8%. This is real GDP growth. The nominal GDP growth was 8%. The difference between real and nominal GDP growth is normally the inflation. Now, was inflation just 0.2% if GDP growth, real GDP growth was 7.8 and nominal was 8? Now, the government has a ready explanation. It says that the real GDP is adjusted for inflation, which is largely wholesale price index. Now, wholesale price index has been falling, and so the inflation is actually so low. Now, this has immediately invited criticism, this kind of GDP calculation, from all sides, from really erudite people, international economists, and our former economic advisor, Arvind Subramanian. The criticism is on two counts of this simple number, both the validity of using wholesale price index as well as how India actually calculates its GDP growth. Now, as for the second, how India calculates GDP growth, India uses income or production approach. Other countries normally use an expenditure approach. Some other countries use a blended approach, which is apparently better. Ashoka Mody, who is a visiting professor of international economic policy at Princeton and a fairly strong critic, some people say biased critic of Indian recent economic performance, he says in principle expenditure should equal income earned, and because producers can earn incomes only when others buy their output. So, while income from production in India actually increased by 7.8% in April to June, which is what the government is claiming from the income method, the expenditure was just about 1.8%. Normally they should balance or balance over a period of time. Now, this difference is just too wide and needs to be accounted for. The government claims that since it has been consistent with its approach, each time only calculating certainly by the income method, it is not at fault and there is nothing to question here. Mody argues that if we apply the US Bureau of Economic Affairs method to India, then the recent growth rate will fall far below the rate of 7.8% and will be just about 4.5%. Now, that's one view. What about the 0.02% inflation? Arvind Subramanian and Josh Feldman, who were writing for Project Syndicate, in the column said 7.8% GDP is okay, but they're skeptical for a different reason. They cast it out on the inflation figure, which is 0.2%. Now, they say that we cannot assume that inflation is being measured properly because this figure is not a hard data. It's technically called GDP deflator, this inflation figure here, and it's not measured directly like the consumer price index. So it is instead a derived number calculated through a methodology which has a lot of problems. The authors go on to list several flaws in the way India calculates its GDP deflator and argue that it will never be the same as CPI. In other major economies, the difference between the GDP deflator and CPI is very little. So practically CPI is the proxy. So in fact, if you use CPI as the proxy for inflation, your 7.8%, your nominal growth of 8% will actually come down to just about 3% real GDP growth if you take CPI inflation to be about 5%. Now, we don't know. Maybe the economy is doing better than 3%, maybe doing better than 4.5%, which Mr. Ashoka Mody points out, or maybe doing far worse. We just do not have a very high quality of reliable data. Now, there are certain traditional data measures, GDP growth, index of industrial production. There are flaws in that, because people have started relying on, and the government is encouraging that people rely on better quality of data, which are called high frequency data. Now, the government itself admits, for instance, a few days ago, the Ministry of Finance official put out in a social media that if anything, India's growth numbers might understate the reality. Why is it much better? Because manufacturing growth indicated by the index of industrial production, which is one of the traditional measures, is far lower than what manufacturing companies are reporting. So the government's own IIP, they claim, is not good enough to reflect the manufacturing buoyancy. Now, to get a better picture of India's growth, one will have to, as I said, look at many other kinds of data, some of which are much more reliable, such as direct tax revenues, e-way bills, GST collections, railway traffic, external trade, and so on. Now, where do we stand on that? On September 22nd, just a few days ago, the government released its monthly economic review. It's certainly a month old, and a lot of data is even 2 months old. The data for the first 5 months of this year does not present a great picture of buoyancy. That's a fact. This is government's own data. Now, there are some positives, most certainly. GST collection increased by 11%. E-way bill volume was up by 16.7%. Cement and steel are doing well. And bank credit expanded 19.7%. This is a really good, strong indicator. But the gross tax revenues for the first 5 months was up only 2.8%. The index of industrial production, as the government says, was up only 4.8%, which is April-July. Power consumption was up 5%, and railway traffic was up just about 2.2%. And most importantly, overall exports were down 5.2% and imports down 10.35%. This is total exports. If you take only merchandise exports, which reflects India's very poor competitiveness, which the government has not been able to address, merchandise exports were down 11.8%, which is very serious. Now, the picture of Indian economy has been one of near stagnation between 2010-11 to roughly 2019. Then we had a pandemic, then a big bounce back post-COVID-19. And now we have sort of muted growth. What has sustained India's economic growth in the last few quarters is massive government expenditure, humongous expenditure, simultaneously deployed in multiple directions. This is like a blitzkrieg. Defense, railways, urban transport, logistics, and many other infrastructure projects like water and so on and so forth. Now, this strategy of creating growth through government capital expenditure is not sustainable in isolation. Where is the government going to get the money from? The government is usually bankrupt. And high growth is not a given, because based on the current data, note that the first 5 months of this year, fiscal deficit and revenue deficit have shot up due to low tax revenues. The government needs other sources of money, and those who are sanguine about the government's capital expenditure driven growth may want to keep an eye on where the government is going to get its additional revenues from if tax revenues don't jump. And of course, the government is not able to continue the program with much increased borrowing, which has a certain cost. If you like this, please do share and do subscribe. Thanks for watching.